Good evening, fellow comparativists. Another episode of CompGov Command coming at you live from the Mid Valley in beautiful Los Angeles County. Let's get into the newest of the nation states in the course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's get it. This is one where news unfolded and history changed in the middle of your course, and there's no way that your textbook could have actually gone ahead and made an account for this change. We are our third supreme leader of the IRI, the Ayatollah Moshtaba Khamenei, and Moshtaba is the son of the second of the supreme leaders, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And there was much dispute about, well, is he really even an Ayatollah, which is an honorific, as you recall, given to some higher level, elite level Shia clerics. But apparently, the Assembly of Experts had decided that he did deserve that title, so it was given to him. It involves like having to do certain high level studies, like akin to a PhD level about Islamic law, and then actually teaching for a certain amount of time. But they said that he cleared that hurdle, so he has that title. And it says here that he just started this year as a result of the death of his father at the hands of the American Israeli forces during Operation Epic Fury. He is the highest authority in Iran because this is an example of a theocratic republic, right? A republic run completely by religious officials. So, that being said, do you have a president? Yes. In the IRI, the current president is Mr. Pezeshkian. And do you have a prime minister? And do you have, therefore, a parliament? It is a unicameral parliament called the Majlis. So, yes, you have those things, but it is not typical of other semi-presidential systems like we see in this course, such as Russia, in that you have a holy leader and a series of clerics advising that holy leader called the Guardian Council and selected by an assembly of experts that basically serve as a giant sort of filter for any policy that these elected officials could possibly make. As a result, the supreme leader has control of the military. In fact, there's a whole other type of military that's not even attached to the regular Iranian military, known as the Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? The IRGC, right? Um, a whole other judiciary, a whole other court system that responds directly to the supreme leader, full access to control media and curb free speech whenever he wishes. And of course, all the key policy decisions are his, along with his guardian council, because they have veto power over everything that the president and the Majlis produces. Speaking of this president, yes, again, just like every other course nation, millions of individuals every election cycle vote in Iran. Again, the name republic in any country means by definition that you have voting happening there. Um, the first three letters, rep and republic, refer to representation as chosen by voters, someone that they have chosen to stand instead of them in an elected body in some kind of legislative assembly and speak on their behalf to make decisions. That's how republics are indirect democracies, whereas some nations, I guess smaller ones with more homogeneous and more educated, populations, could run a direct democracy where literally, like, government bodies ask citizens about every decision they could possibly make. With technology on board in a small country that's hyper literate, you could probably run something like that, but it still would be very cumbersome. It's more efficient for larger nations with more people over a vast area. And Iran checks all those boxes. Four times more land than Iraq, for instance. Much greater population than Iraq. So it makes sense to keep the republic there. But the idea of having a religious voice to serve as the final arbiter of the law, regardless of what the will of the people is expressed by this legislative body are, that's a new thing that we're going to get into later on as we move through and talk about the first of the supreme leaders, the Ayatollah Khomeini, right, and the guardianship of the jurist. But we'll get there as we move through. You don't have any parties in Iran. I don't know if you want to call that the no party system, the zero party system, to contrast with the one party system of China, the two party system that seems to exist currently right now in Nigeria, but could become three, right? And then the multi party systems of, looking at Mexico and looking at the UK, and the dominant party system that we see where there are multiple parties in the Russian Federation, but really United Russia calls all the shots, right? Yeah, and instead, different sort of temporary factions manifest every election cycle as individuals vie for being honored by being selected by the Guardian Council as acceptable candidates, right? And there are various different groups that can form into factions. You can have hardliners who are strictly about being in line with the fundamentalist teachings of Sharia law as derived from the Quran, and individuals who are a bit more pragmatic, who want to push for more economic and social reforms to stabilize the Iranian population in that reform category, right? Because of this, you basically have a safeguard against any threats to the supreme leader's power. Because if no actual parties exist, then therefore you don't get any longitudinal sort of accretion of political power through multiple election cycles, which can eventually make someone in the country so popular they could topple the supreme leader and oust the Guardian Council, right? There was an example of that, but not with the supreme leader, but with his predecessor, the Shah, in the form of Mohammad Mossadegh. And so we'll get to that example later on. And it became something that both the Shah and later the supreme leader learned from in terms of the dangers of letting charismatic individuals develop permanent political movements inside the Majlis, right? Like we talked about, if you want to become the supreme leader, you got to go ahead and be chosen by the Assembly of Experts, which is half derived from people from the Guardian Council, who are the same people who are going to be advising you if you were to become the supreme leader, and half chosen by people from the Majlis, the parliament, but who are also very much vetted by and chosen by the Guardian Council, right? So it gets the illusion that elected officials had some say in choosing the supreme leader. But what if those people were selected by the Guardian Council in the first place? So you see this feedback loop where the Guardian Council works with the supreme leader, and some of them are in the Assembly of Experts to choose the next one. And they were already in deliberation because the second supreme leader, Moshaba's father, Ali Khamenei, was already in his 80s. Like they'd realize he's already on his way out. They're already kind of talking about which individuals served as good possible, successors to him if he were to pass naturally. But that didn't happen that way, right? He's slain, and then later on, what we see is that the targeting of high level officials and high level ayatollahs that could have been chosen as the next supreme leader was so efficient that basically you skip down a number of people past some of the preferred individuals that some American politicians like Mr. Trump would have preferred to be in people that he thought maybe he could work better with in terms of making a deal on, for instance, the enrichment of uranium, down all the way to the son of Ali Khamenei, Moshtaba, who was a very, very aggressive hardliner. So that kind of backfired in the end, from that standpoint. But again, this closed loop of the Ayatollahs selecting from inside their own ranks individuals that they think are safe picks to continue to shepherd the IRI towards that preferred stance of religious purity to prepare for the return of the 12th Imam in typical 12er Shia doctrine. And we'll talk about what it means to be a 12er when we get down and talk about the historical influence of the first of the supreme leaders, the Ayatollah Khomeini. All right. Um, as we're going to see the same thing with China, right? This is not rule of law where there's due process, equal protections of the law, and individuals who commit crimes are punished equally. No, this is ruled by law, where the law is weaponized by the state in order to dominate and control people. And we'll talk about the cycles of the increasingly more frequent cycles of protest by the Iranian people that have happened ever since the IRI came into existence in 79, all the way up to the present day. These protests are frequent, and in many ways, they're triggered, almost 2/3 of them triggered by economic problems, the rest triggered by civil rights violations and attacks on women. People forget that one of the groups to actually really prosper in the previous regime that existed, led by the Shah, were Iranian women, particularly those in the cities like Tehran. Women in Tehran were going around with no hijabs on. It looks like the streets of San Francisco, and you look at some videos and some old documentaries showing what like Tehran was like in the late 60s and the early 70s. It's kind of wild, actually. Um, Many Islamists, many hardliners who were more fans of more traditional societal arrangements were kind of definitely angered by this such freedom that women were going around in Iran under the Shah, flaunting, their lack of hijabs and other religious dress. And as we'll note, like we have the examples there of the Green Movement, which was actually a situation that was kind of a bit of electoral alchemy on the part of the second of the supreme leaders, I guess Supreme Leader Khamenei the Elder, right? Ali Khamenei, in which he put his thumb on the scale to choose to re-elect President Ahmadinejad. This is the same individual, in case you're just wondering, who claimed that he vowed to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And again, obviously hardliner, obviously fundamentalist, and you can see why the supreme leader was a fan of his. The reform candidate Musavi had, I think, won handily. And if you look at the data, it's very strange. In '04, when Ahmadinejad won, it was 63% of the vote. And when he's reelected in 2008, miraculously, it seemed to be the same exact amount of the vote. And immediately, people in Tehran and other cities went out in the streets protesting because they knew that he must have lost. He was not popular at all. The economy was tanking under American sanctions and European sanctions. Um, it was brutally repressed. And the supreme leader came out and said it was divine consideration, it was divine will that Ahmadinejad go ahead and be basically reelected as president. Um, Fast forward into the 2020s, and now we start seeing repression of women becoming one of the main themes for the protests. And basically, a pattern emerges in both situations where not only is it the police coming out to stop protesters. Remember, in the second case, we're talking about there was a case I believe that involved Masa Amini, who was a woman who basically got targeted because of some sort of violation of the hijab laws. And again, this does not deal with any sort of appropriate headdress and whatnot and facial covering. It also deals with things such as hairstyle, things such as cosmetic use and makeup, um, any sort of adornment that considered to be inappropriate could be a violation of the hijab laws and cause women to be arrested by special religious police. That again, if you could look at the org chart, they all flow up along the side of the org chart that eventually goes all the way up to the supreme leader. All right. So you can get persecuted by people with badges who are police officers of certain types. You can also be set upon and attacked by a group of paramilitary sort of part-time soldiers known as Basijis, right? And then eventually, if it gets really bad and they really need to go ahead and end the protest quickly, then they bring out formal IRGC units when it gets really serious. And by that time, yeah, people are getting shot and killed. And I think just this week, I think the IRGC tried and hanged 3 people for protesting what's going on right now in the Strait of Hormuz. Um, so yeah, that's when the muscle is quite readily available for the supreme leader if he feels like he needs to make a move to sort of repress the people, right? So already what we've seen is a blend of some Mexican themes where it seems to be that there's electoral alchemy that the supreme leader can employ in times to make sure that he and the Guardian Council get the right people that they want installed as president and prime minister, even though they already have the idea that they can veto anything that they say anyway. So it's like dual methods of control there. You also have a bit of the feelings of the Dedazo from the PRI days in Mexico, as you can imagine, because it's these clerics, then they're multiple ayatollahs, and they're elevating one of their own to become the supreme leader. And so they're able to pick and choose from among themselves and rotate this power among themselves based on whoever they think is more essentially, ready for the task and more qualified at that moment and best suited to those moments. And the tools that they use to maintain this system is complete censorship of the media. As you can recall, when the protest first started off early in this year, and there were calls because of economic disturbance, because of the hard sanctions and whatnot, causing there to be essentially skyrocketing prices due to a scarcity of goods inside of country in Iran. One of the first moves they did was to go ahead and shut off the internet and shut off the ability for individuals to broadcast anything from outside the country into global news outlets. Now, stuff still leaked through, and you know, the smartphones are going to smartphone, right? So videos were able to get released, so we had an idea what was going on there. But there are things akin to sort of like a junior version of the Chinese Great Firewall, in which they can control internet access and control TV flows. And if they find people in violation of these things still, if people still won't go back into their homes and stop protesting, then they'll go ahead and start arresting people. And they do have the ability to go through found footage online to see if you were there, and they can go back and retroactively go and arrest you and do what they will to you, or sick the besiegers on you, whatever that might be. Again, this is rule by law. So as soon as a protest begins, the longer it lasts, the more it emboldens the population. So a ruthless repression has to happen. So in the same way we saw during this calendar year before Operation Epic Fury started, um, brutal repression of Iranian protesters, with some estimates saying up to between 15 and 30,000 killed in the most recent round of protesting. We're going to revisit this again when we talk about Tiananmen Square when we get to China to wrap up, these videos. Rule by law, friends. The law is a weapon used to force basically obedience on people. All right. Now let's get back to a more academic topic here and talk about, well, what's up with the institutions in the IRI? Again, you have elected officials who sit in legislative capacities, which are highly constrained by religious officers above them, right? So you do have a situation where you have elected individuals, again, mentioned in the parliament, and therefore it has a prime minister, the IRI, and you do elect a president, but this president and the prime minister and the entire Majlis are subservient to appointees such as the supreme leader and the guardian council, right? The appointed individuals in this government have far, far more authority than the elected ones do. And the same thing's going to be true of the PRC when we talk about China in a moment. Can reform happen? Yeah, ish, but it's only going to happen if the Guardian Council feels like it's in the nation's best interest, right? Um, for instance, I've seen many situations in which there have been proposals to do things like relax the hijab laws a little bit, or do things in which they would like to go ahead and try to open up negotiations. This is before Operation Epic Fury, but open up negotiations more and try to do more to work with Europe and work with the US to relieve sanctions, to get more economic output going and improve things like employment and improve the number of consumer goods in country to lower prices, right? And tamp down inflation. But no, it just oftentimes, if it's thought to make the supreme leader look weak internationally, or thought that it would make the opponents of the regime stronger as a result, then these things were very much vetoed by the Guardian Council. All right. They have theocratic goals that are more theological in nature rather. It's a nation of people focused on religious dogma, and what happens in that situation is that very few individuals at the higher levels of government really care kind of what's going on with the economy. Now, that's very interesting we say that, because we're talking about a nation that sits on some of the richest reserves of fossil fuels in the world. So there is much wealth, even if it would be as it was before under the Shah, incredibly resource cursed and rentier state situation. You can still derive some wealth for the people through selling these goods on the global market. So um, the fact that this still happens despite the sanctions means that you need to start looking at who benefits from those sales. That's mostly China, India, Pakistan. These are some of their main energy buyers. And what you see is that a lot of times these things are moved vis-a-vis channels that are illegal, right? These are more smuggled, right? And so we start talking about things like shadow fleets and stuff of that nature. And then the IRGC pops up again as a main vehicle to help move oil illicitly through back channels, kind of akin to how Russia was doing that during the current Ukraine war. Only now certain European states have started realizing how to spot these shadow fleet vessels, how to isolate them, and how to start boarding them and seizing their cargoes and stuff. Um, but all of these extreme measures to go move all the oil, all these things are because reform and pragmatism have been tamped down recently in favor of hardline extremism. And again, like I told you before, if there were any reformers that could have possibly risen to the position of supreme leader, for the most part, those folks are deceased or disabled and they can't do it. Even from all accounts that I've read, Moshtaba Khamenei right now, the current third supreme leader, is heavily wounded on that attack, and he has not even made a public appearance. So, I mean, they almost don't even have him, if you think about it. So, hardliners are most certainly in vogue now. And every time war occurs, it just goes ahead and edifies these individuals, right? Think back to 1980, the year after the Islamic Revolution, and the IRI embarks upon a war with their neighbor Iraq to the west, which was very heavily financed by openly and overtly by the US, while secretly the IRI was secretly given materials for war vis-a-vis the Iran Contra scandal by the US, right? So automatically, this attempt to have these individuals of Sunni orientation, such as Saddam Hussein, invade and try to attack this brand new republic, just served to give even more impetus and more strength to the Ayatollah Khomeini when he took over, right? Um, it's always been my situation that you empower all of these religious institutions when you threaten them with violence. They're very poor when it comes to actually running. Well, and this is what ideologues are. And we're going to see the same thing with Mao versus Deng in China. Hardcore ideologues are never really good at running economic affairs. because it requires more pragmatic thinking that they're just be not like, that great at. They see all these big ideals and economy kind of off to the side. But if you don't take care of your people economically, you don't make sure that they're employed, you don't make sure that they're getting well educated, you don't make sure that they have access to all the goods and services that they need, they will be out in the streets and they will come for you. Unless you repress them first, right? And so we'll talk about um, the situation where Mao makes a giant mistake with the Great Leap Forward, and he realizes now that people can start questioning him. So he gets in front of that and institutes the Cultural Revolution with the Great Proletariat in order to sort of figure out who might go ahead and try to call him out and say that he made errors and nip them in the bud and isolate them, either purge them or exile them or kill them in some cases before they can go ahead and prove him to be kind of a bit of a disaster in terms of his economic policy, which he was. The only way you can make this apparatus that can snap back at people before they can criticize you is to centralize power and make sure that all the people who buy into enforcing your version of events as the ideologue in charge, in this case, the supreme leader and his guardian council, you got to have really powerful, for lack of a better word, minions that will do your bidding. And there you have, like I said, the IRGC, you have the religious police, you have the Basij, you have all those people in line and who are diehard to believe in what you believe in, to go ahead and repress those who wish to threaten your power. Because if your power is toppled and their power as like, you're the employer of them is in question, it weakens their status too. And plus, I'd make the argument that the IRGC is the one who's doing a lot to move the oil these days, and therefore the IRGC is flush with cash. Um, and a lot of that money has gone into drones, the Shahed drones in particular. Mossadegh is, oh man, it's a sad story. So here you are, it's the 50s. You're noticing a trend that after World War II, the UK are kind of retracting from their colonial ventures, trying to go ahead and move more towards, again, the collective consensus. Let's do what's best for Britons. But there's still a very outsized situation of economic influence in the oil and the petroleum drilling industries, as them and their US partners are the ones who primarily set up the AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, right? Um, Coming up as a very charismatic voice in the Majlis, eventually becoming the prime minister in 51. Mossadegh decides to form a group, a coalition of all these individuals who are supporting him, a supermajority called the National Front. And again, we're looking at like people looking at, why might it be dangerous to allow parties to exist? Well, Mossadegh is the reason, right? Because once he became so popular and had a supermajority in the Majlis, he's able to use that overt popularity to essentially dislodge the Shah for all intents and purposes and become the individual who's a strongman leader of Iran. Now, the Shah was a major partner of oil interests in the UK and in the United States, and so on his behalf, and also on oil companies' behalf, I reckon the U.S. activated Kermit Roosevelt and his CIA branch in Tehran to go ahead and begin Operation Ajax. And 2 years later, Mossadegh is ousted and the Shah is restored. This begins the first moment in people like the first Ayatollah, supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, to understand that the West will overtly get super involved in Iranian politics to the point so the West benefits, but it just weakens Iran, right? This is where that concept of West toxification begins. This idea that like the West is only here for their own benefit, and their influence on our people is corrosive. It's acidic. It's sickening us. It's destroying us. Right. It also showed people that maybe this Majli situation, which coincidentally was birthed by the Kahar dynasty right there in 1905, which is the same year that the Tsar created the Duma in their neighbors to the north, Russia. I don't know if that's coincidental or not, but two different parliaments built in the same year. That's kind of a funny thing. Um, Either way, that these Western notions in Asiatic administrations, or at least Eurasiatic, we're talking about Russia, right? They like to fancy themselves European, but there's a considerable part of that country rests in Asia, as we know. Um, this idea is that maybe this Western sort of style governments really isn't for us. Um, Especially when you think about the Western backed monarch Shah Reza Pahlavi there, who, oh man, I mean, the man tried. He understood that the reason why Iran was resource cursed as it was because it lacked manufacturing. He already kind of saw around the corner of what Mexico was going to achieve later on during the 90s with things like NAFTA to go ahead and USMCA to go ahead and develop more of their own manufacturing so they can reduce the dependency of their export markets strictly on oil sales, right? So he pursues his white revolution. Big parts of it involve land reform, sadly taking a lot of land from clerical organizations who held a lot of this situation in terms of some of the nicer possible housing regions, expanding education to, and this is wild, to women. All right, Shaw understood that one of the main ways to level up your GDP, if you're mostly patriarchal, is to educate the other half of the workforce and unleash them by giving them jobs. Right. Again, that seems obvious to someone who's educated and trained in the West. That's not going to go well to people who are traditionally living by their old paternalistic value systems, right? And so, if you were an enemy of the white revolution, you then had to deal with not an open forum with, a chance to speak freely. This is where maybe the Shah messed up, obviously, and started to sick the Sabak, the secret police, on people. And they talk about like the ends justifying the means. Like, do you want to uplift women? Do you want to boost up your economy and grow GDP and lift your people out of relative resource cursed poverty? That sounds great, but you want to do it by disappearing people and torturing people and jailing them for no reason? I don't know if you can justify that, right? But that's exactly what he was doing. And that simply emboldened more of the opponents of the Shah, including one cleric, one individual whose followers were beaten in the holy city of Qom in the 1960s, who was jailed multiple times and later on exiled and sent to Turkey, and then made a series of messages in the form of cassette tapes saying them back as contraband into the nation to encourage them to ditch this Western leader and begin to prepare Iran for the return of the 12th Imam. And he is Ruhollah Khomeini. But again, understand this. The same thing that we saw kind of in Russia and we'll see again in China is that you're trying to make too many economic reforms too quickly. You got to be more gradual with it. In Mao's Great Leap Forward, he wants to make all these major changes to the economy and do it within a decade. Mistakes were made. Same thing here. If he did some work with the Majlis to engender there being a legit body of moderate lawmakers that were elected and whatnot, and not firebrands like Mossadegh who weren't going to oppose him but work with him, then maybe over time this could have been something that would have been more effective. But to push this on the people of Iran so quickly. Just the people weren't ready. They just weren't ready for it. Just weren't ready for it. And again, all of this work towards becoming modern from Western perspective was a waste of time from Khomeini's perspective, because any given time, the 12th Shia, the 12th Imam could return and focus strictly on theological matters, and therefore, who cares what's going on with the economy? How many cars you're building instead of how much oil you're selling? The economy, schmeconomy, nobody cares, right? Under that situation, which is wild because GDP plummets on the switch over from the Shah, which was rising under him. It plummets when it switches over after the Islamic Revolution to the IRI under the leadership of Khomeini. But he has such charisma and he has such legal authority as a Muslim scholar that those combinations of those two sources of legitimacy made him almost like goated in terms of their politics. And you should watch, if you haven't seen it yet, you should watch some of the footage from his funeral. It's wild. Now, people forgot about that event. It happened to be the same day as a certain protest involving a man and some tanks in China and Beijing. But no, he achieved almost like a cult of personality status. Khomeini did, and made a very difficult act for subsequent supreme leaders to follow, for sure. The next one up was the current individual, Moshtaba Khamenei's father, Ali Khamenei, who just continued the work of Khomeini by essentially getting more and more of the clerics on the same page. Some people say that no, he's not as hardline as his predecessor. That could be true. After all, President Obama of the U.S. was able to work the nuclear deal with him under his administration. But again, that kind of, basically making concessions and compromises with the West might have been what turned his son in such a hardliner in response to what his dad was doing. And basically, again, if you're looking at Operation Ajax as what eventually led to the installation of the first supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, then the most current iteration of a U.S. Operation Epic Fury, is what directly leads to the installation of the third supreme leader, Moshtaba Khamenei. And again, that's not going to do much to go ahead and dissuade people from the hardliners from saying, see, this is West toxication again. They're trying to infect us again with their ideas. But here we are again, the same old soup just reheated, right? The key themes are this: religion, obviously, is the center of all political authority. You could be the most popular president of all time. Doesn't matter what you do. You can be the most influential prime minister of the Majlis since Mossadegh. Doesn't matter what you do. If the clerics don't want to follow your advice, then nothing's going to happen based on what you say. All right. People who were appointed and unelected, such as clerics, such as generals, such as police chiefs and whatnot, these are the individuals who run the country, basically. All right. They allow for selected people, vetted people to run for office, and they already know that they're tame, essentially. They're not going to do too much to shake the political foundations, so therefore they're safe to run for office. And again, even if they get elected and they try to do something different, they still have veto power over them anyway, right? Anytime the Iranian people dissent, they are brutally repressed by not only a host of people of different military and police associations, but also by paramilitary groups as well. And therefore, because there isn't really any legitimacy, to speak of when protests happen, the moment that governments have to resort to violence to keep people in line, they no longer have any legitimacy, right? So it's like you're building up legitimacy in your cup, and then immediately you poke a hole in it the moment that you turn guns on your own people to force them to stop protesting. So civil society does exist there, but it's very, very tenuous. And people have to be very careful who they associate with, because the moment they're outed as individuals who are against the regime, they are brutally repressed. And more on that when we talk about their main oil trade partner, China, when we get there. And again, like I said, the idea of West toxication is alive and well. A whole new generation of Iranian children will remember the time that basically the supreme leader got bombed by the West, and the whole new hardline regime was born from these very aggressive interventions by Western militaries. Obviously, your comp is to this no party system to maybe a very firm and iron fisted one party system. So maybe an Iran versus China comp could be done there. Um, the idea of what constitutes revolution. Many things go for the name of revolution in this particular chapter. Um, so, what's real in a revolution sense in terms of causing regime change, and what really isn't revolution? It's just revolution in name only, right? And of course, this very unique idea of having religion be at the core of your governance. Because after all, the UK has their own official religion, the Anglican Church, but does the Archbishop of Canterbury run the UK and have veto power over the prime minister? No. So it's not just an official religion, it's also the source of all political power. And of course, when you see these sorts of things, that middle one simply is just the translation of guardianship of the jurist right there. So here's your takeaway as we wrap up this video. Iran is a theocratic authoritarian system shaped by modernization, repression, and revolution, where religious leadership dominates political power. And again, modernizing in some aspects, state of the art drone tech, getting better at surveillance state technology thanks to their collaboration with China, experts at repression of dissident voices, and some things really being revolutions, like in 79. Okay, the Islamic Revolution was real, but the white revolution, like, again, I'd argue if you have a revolution that's being stated as one, it's a revolution, but the same authority figure who called for it is in charge when it's done. Was that really revolution? I don't know. I don't think so, but you tell me different if you think so. And again, where religious leaders dominate political power, and they're not going to have any change in that anytime soon. Um, it would take considerable amount of assistance from overseas to arm Iranian dissidents enough to go ahead and take on the IRGC, which is funded and equipped by all sorts of oil money, um, to topple this regime. All right. So there you have it, friends. The up to date, lining up with the new Supreme Leader IRI presentation. Hope this was informative for you. And we'll see you next time for China. See you later. Peace.